I keep rereading the message, each word driving deeper into my chest. Bro, I hate to be the one to tell you this, but you need to come see for yourself. She's at Golden Ember Bar, and she's not alone. I never imagined myself as someone who would end up here, sitting alone in the middle of the night, gripping my phone tightly, my heart pounding as I read this message. Golden Ember Bar, a familiar spot. The place where we'd laughed, felt connected, felt whole, before everything changed. Before she began to distance herself, I almost ignored the message, almost convinced myself it was a mistake or some twisted joke. But deep inside, a raw instinct refused to ignore reality. I grabbed my keys, heart pounding as I drove through empty streets, memories flooding back, the missed dinners, whispered phone calls, her increasingly late nights. I doubted myself before, thinking I was just paranoid. But this was undeniable, and I was going to face it head on. The moment I entered the lounge, my eyes found her instantly. Olivia, my wife, the woman I'd loved deeply, trusted completely, the person I'd built my entire world around. She was there, at the bar, smiling warmly, not just smiling, but leaning in intimately, fingers lightly touching a man's arm, someone I'd never seen before. He had a smug look, the expression of someone certain he'd won. They weren't even bothering to hide. My legs froze, body numb, mind racing. Yet inside, something burned fiercely. She laughed at his words, throwing her head back casually, touching him with affection I hadn't felt in ages. I could have confronted them, could have demanded answers, could have created chaos. But I didn't. Instead, quietly, I took out my phone and captured a photo. Not for revenge or evidence, but to hold on to this moment. Because I knew clearly, this was the moment I lost what I thought I had. I didn't say a single word to her that night. I left the lounge before she could notice me, before she could craft another excuse or dismiss it as nothing. But the next morning, I sat at the dining table waiting. The coffee in front of me was untouched, cooling slowly, waiting for her to stroll in as if nothing had happened. When she finally appeared, she barely glanced my way. "Morning," she mumbled, pouring her coffee casually like it was just another day. My jaw tightened. I slid my phone across the table toward her. Her own phone buzzed right as she reached for her cup. She glanced down, sighed impatiently, then lazily looked at my phone screen. Her face turned pale. She looked up, eyes quickly narrowing, calculating, assessing, not guilty, not ashamed, just irritated. "So, you're spying on me now?" she accused flatly. A bitter laugh escaped me. "Spying? That's an interesting way to put it," I said evenly, steadier than I felt. "I was just confirming what you'd already decided to do behind my back." She sighed dramatically, rolling her eyes. "You're being ridiculous." Her sheer audacity nearly pushed me over the edge. "I caught you with another man, Olivia." My voice was cold, controlled. "You were practically all over him, yet you're acting like I'm the issue here." She crossed her arms, boredom spreading across her features. "You don't own me, Brandon." I froze. Her words struck me like she'd accused me of something terrible, like I'd somehow crossed the line. "I never claimed I did," I replied quietly, dangerously calm. "But I thought we at least had respect. I thought what we had was real." She exhaled dismissively, shaking her head as though I were throwing a childish tantrum. "You're overreacting," she muttered, brushing past me to pick up her purse. I was stunned. She didn't deny it. She didn't apologize. She was just done talking about it. My hands shook with controlled anger as I followed her to the door. "What exactly do you expect me to do, Olivia?" I asked, voice barely above a whisper. She turned slightly, eyebrow raised in challenge. "I don't know. Be a man about it," she said coldly, lips twisting into a cruel smirk. Then she walked out effortlessly, as if nothing had happened, as if I were nothing. I stood motionless, staring at the empty space she'd left behind. That's when it hit me. She expected me to chase after her, to lose control, to fight for her, proving how desperately I wanted her. She anticipated the drama, the begging, the heated arguments. She wanted me to break, to beg her to stay, to choose me. Because in her eyes, as long as I fought for her, she had control. But what if the fight never came? What if I just stopped playing? What happens when the man she counted on never leaving simply vanishes? Taking a deep, steadying breath, I made up my mind. She wanted me to chase her. Instead, I decided I'd let her feel my absence. That would mark the beginning of her regret. I didn't argue, didn't yell, didn't beg. That's exactly what she wanted, what she expected. The more I thought about it, the clearer it became. This wasn't about love or passion, but about power and control, keeping me in a game she thought she controlled. So I simply stopped playing. After she left, I took my time finishing my coffee, staring at her empty chair, absorbing the weight of her betrayal, the humiliation, the blatant disrespect. Then quietly I stood, grabbed my laptop, and started preparing. First, I secured my finances. The joint account had always depended heavily on my salary. She had her paycheck, but we both knew who covered most of our expenses. Not anymore. I transferred most of my money to my personal account, leaving just enough to avoid suspicion. I logged into every account, utilities, credit cards, rent, and removed my name. She wanted independence? She'd have it, brutally clear. Next was the lease. Both our names were on it, but I'd always paid the rent. Not anymore. I called the landlord to break the lease early. "You're ending your lease early." The landlord sounded surprised. "Yes," I said calmly. "Just tell me the penalties. I'll cover my share." I wouldn't cause her legal trouble. That wasn't my intention. But she'd definitely feel the reality of my absence. Afterward, I moved quietly around the apartment, efficiently packing the essentials. My clothes, personal paperwork, and just a few items that actually meant something. Everything else, it was hers now. By the time I finished, it was getting late. She hadn't called or sent a single message. She still thought I was going to explode, to react dramatically. She had no idea she'd already lost me the moment she walked out the door. The following morning, I got up early, lighter than I'd felt in ages. I went through my morning routine calmly, brushing my teeth, getting dressed, cooking breakfast. But today, there was no second cup of coffee, no note left behind, no waiting for her return. I'd already arranged a temporary stay at a modest, furnished apartment across the city. Nothing special, just a place to breathe and regain clarity. I was gone before she even stirred. My phone stayed off. I wanted to see how long it would take her to notice. By lunchtime, I switched it back on. 5 missed calls, several texts. Her first messages seemed casual enough, pretending everything was fine, asking if I'd left early for work, even using a pet name as though nothing happened. I didn't open any of them. I wasn't going to give her the satisfaction of an immediate reaction. She needed to feel the silence. That night, curiosity made me check again. One voicemail waited. I hesitated briefly before listening. Initially, it was just background sounds. Then her voice, impatient, irritated. "Brandon, really? Are you seriously ignoring me?" She sighed loudly. "Whatever tantrum you're throwing, just stop it. Call me back." I laughed bitterly. A tantrum? That's what she thought this was. Not a consequence of her actions, but my childishness. She still thought I was playing along, still believed I'd eventually break. She thought she still mattered. I deleted the voicemail immediately. The next morning passed quietly. Around midday, the text resumed, noticeably more impatient. On day 2, confusion seeped in. Her messages grew shorter, sharper, losing the casual edge. By day 3, irritation took over. She wasn't just wondering where I was anymore. She was demanding answers, accusing me of being overly dramatic, questioning if I'd actually left her. On day 4, the confidence started cracking. Her tone shifted to uncertainty, frustration mixing with worry. She insisted I respond, called it ridiculous, then quickly demanded explanations. She still wasn't getting it. She still assumed this was a temporary game. By the 5th, then, the desperation surfaced. Her texts came rapid fire, begging to talk, needing clarity, unsure what was going on. Finally, regret. She convinced herself I'd come crawling back, eager to win her approval, desperate for her attention. But now reality hit hard. The calls began again. I didn't answer. I let the reality sink in. I let her truly grasp what losing me felt like. She'd spent too long believing I was permanently available, always waiting. But now she was finally realizing the truth. I was gone, and this was just the beginning of her downfall. Initially, she probably enjoyed it. The freedom, the space, the thrill of doing whatever she pleased without thinking about me. In the days following my departure, I imagined her smugly dismissing my silence, thinking I'd eventually break, assuming I was sulking, waiting for me to beg forgiveness. She was convinced I needed her more. She thought I'd return first, admitting defeat. But as days became a week, then stretched further, reality crept in, revealing something she'd never truly believed. I wasn't coming back. At first, she barely noticed the changes, only the absence of my voice, my texts, my presence. Then smaller inconveniences piled up. Groceries ran low. I had always handled the essentials, filling the fridge without complaint. Now, when she reached into cupboards, they were bare. Laundry sat abandoned. I had quietly managed more than she'd ever acknowledged. Soon she realized that while I'd always done my laundry, I'd often taken care of hers as well. Now her clothes piled up, neglected. The bills were next. At first, she hardly noticed them. Sure, she earned her own money, but handling the finances, paying everything on schedule, had always been my responsibility. When the initial overdue notice arrived, she brushed it off as a mistake. A second one followed quickly, then a third. It wasn't until the internet got disconnected that genuine panic set in 2 weeks after I had left. Her messages had transformed completely by this point. Early on, she'd been dismissive, casually asking where I'd gone, telling me to stop being overly dramatic. Now her questions shifted, not if I'd returned, but when. She'd grown accustomed to my constant presence, believing I'd always remain steadfast no matter how she treated me. To her, I was an anchor, permanent and unyielding. It had never crossed her mind that I might simply let go. Her new relationship, the very reason she'd thrown ours away, was already faltering. Even before discovering her betrayal, I'd noticed signs. She'd mistaken the excitement for something lasting, convinced herself she'd found something better, more thrilling. Yet chasing excitement meant facing its inevitable fade. Stability was something I'd quietly provided, a comfort she'd taken entirely for granted. Now she was discovering that her new partner had never intended to fill that role. He began distancing himself, canceling dates, responding less frequently. Initially, she probably didn't understand why. She'd convinced herself he'd offer what I couldn't, believing the grass truly was greener. But reality was setting in, and her loneliness grew more obvious. After a full month of silence, she finally resurfaced. Not through texts or calls, but at my doorstep. I expected her eventually. I'd deliberately chosen a place nearby, distant enough to vanish from her daily life, yet close enough for her to find when desperation took hold. It had. One evening, a hesitant knock echoed at the door, soft at first, growing louder. I allowed her to wait, imagining the nerves building, then slowly opened it. There she stood, appearing unlike herself, her hair disheveled, tension visible in her face and stance. For once, she looked uncertain, hesitant. She opened her mouth to speak, but nothing emerged initially. Leaning against the doorway with arms folded, I waited. Finally, she cleared her throat. "Can we talk?" I didn't reply immediately, simply studying her expression. Regret was clear now, the realization that she'd traded away her secure, comfortable life for something superficial, fleeting. The understanding that I'd no longer be there to pick up the pieces, that she'd gambled our relationship on a meaningless distraction. "What exactly should we talk about?" I asked calmly. Her lips parted, hesitation clear. For a moment, it seemed she might admit everything, apologize sincerely, but she didn't. She wasn't ready yet. Instead, she sighed quietly. "You really just left?" I shrugged calmly. "Isn't that what you wanted?" She looked away sharply, exhaling. "I didn't think you'd actually—" She trailed off, shaking her head slightly. "Forget it." I remained silent, letting her struggle with her thoughts. She had nothing substantial left to say. She was realizing she'd already lost, even if she hadn't fully accepted it yet. She'd come expecting me to give in, thinking I'd see her again and crumble, desperate to patch things up. She'd believed her presence alone would restore control, but that power had vanished, and she felt it now. The silence stretched, uncomfortable and heavy, before I finally spoke. "You should go," her eyes snapped up. "What? We're done here." Shock briefly flickered across her face. She'd arrived expecting something, anything, and found only emptiness. The Olivier emptiness she'd once left me with. For the first time, her expression shifted from defiance and arrogance to genuine regret. Crushing regret filled her eyes, but it was too late. I stepped back quietly and closed the door. For the first time in a long while, I felt truly free. She didn't move right away. On the other side of the door, I stood still, listening carefully. At first, silence hung heavily between us. Then came a soft shuffle, a faint sigh, a pause filled with uncertainty. I pictured her standing motionless, staring at the closed door, trying desperately to grasp how she'd lost control. For once, she wasn't the one leaving, and that realization probably burned through her like poison. Eventually, after what seemed like an eternity, I heard her footsteps retreating down the hall, the reluctant click of her shoes fading away. And then she was gone, truly gone. This time it was different. I was the one who had left her behind. I thought that would be the end of it, but perhaps I was naive to think she'd give up so easily. A week later, her messages started again. Short, cautious texts at first. "Hey." I ignored it. Hours later, "How have you been?" Again, I didn't respond. 2 days passed before she finally said something substantial. I messed up. Can we talk, please? That final word caught my attention, not because I believed it sincere, but because I knew how much it cost her pride to write it. I imagined her struggling, hesitating, facing the discomfort of being the one ignored. She had expected me to chase her, to fight for her affection. Now she was the one left hanging, and I remained silent. Several days later, she escalated, calling me directly. My phone lit up, her name flashing insistently, but I made no move to answer. After endless ringing, it stopped. A voicemail appeared shortly after. I waited hours before playing it. Her voice was softer this time, shaken, vulnerable. Brandon, I don't even know what to say. She began softly, pausing uncomfortably. I miss you. I miss us. I didn't realize it until now. Another pause, heavy and uncertain. I know you probably don't want to hear from me, but I just wanted to talk. Call me back. The voicemail ended abruptly. For a fleeting moment, I felt something, not hope, not sadness, just a brief glimpse of what might have been. But it vanished quickly because I knew better. This wasn't love or true remorse. It was regret, fear of having lost something irreplaceable. She didn't miss me. She missed the convenience of having me. Yet she persisted. Days later, I ran into a mutual friend who hesitated before speaking. She's struggling, they admitted. That's not my concern, I said simply. I know, they responded quickly, adding softly, but she's regretting everything. I laughed quietly, shaking my head. Regret doesn't mean much once it's too late. They nodded, understanding, knowing I was right. And somewhere deep down, she probably knew it too. Another call followed soon after, another voicemail filled with desperation. I don't understand, Brandon. Her voice trembled with frustration and disbelief. How can you just walk away after everything? Her voice cracked slightly, emotion seeping through her words, a mixture of anger and hurt. She still didn't get it. She thought I owed her something, an explanation, closure, another chance, but she'd walked away from me long before I'd ever returned the favor. She had risked everything, believing I'd be waiting when she was ready to return. But now she stood amidst the wreckage of her choices, understanding too late that some things can't be repaired. And it drove her crazy. She despised that I wasn't following her script, wasn't giving her the chance to reshape our story. So I stayed silent. Not because I didn't have words left, but because I'd already said everything I needed to that night. I walked away. She'd chosen not to listen then. Now silence was my final response. And it was driving her insane. I could see it clearly through her increasingly desperate messages. They started off arrogant, then turned confused, then angry, and finally frantic. I ignored every single call and text. Each attempt was her way of pulling me back into her drama, demanding a reaction. She wasn't seeking forgiveness. She was trying to regain control. But I'd taken that control from her, and without it, she crumbled. It took 2 months for her to fully collapse. At first, she pretended everything was fine. She went out with friends, smiling brightly, posting pictures, projecting confidence and independence. But eventually reality crept in. Stories filtered back to me, her finances spiraling out of control, her carefully maintained lifestyle unraveling. She'd underestimated just how much I'd supported our life financially, how dependent she'd become on my stability. Soon enough, the outing slowed. The facade slipped. Worst of all, the man she'd left me for had vanished once the excitement wore off. He never intended to stay, and once the thrill faded, so did he. She'd bet it all on a fleeting moment and lost badly. Then came the night I knew she'd finally hit bottom. I'd just gotten home, enjoying the peace of a life free from constant anxiety, when a hesitant knock came at the door. I knew who it was before I moved. Part of me considered ignoring it completely, leaving her outside, alone and uncertain. But curiosity got the better of me. I opened the door slowly, and there she stood. She looked nothing like her usual self. Makeup hurriedly done, clothes mismatched, hair slightly messy. But it was her eyes that told the real story. The confidence, the pride, the stubborn certainty were gone. In their place, only emptiness, the painful recognition that she'd destroyed something irreplaceable. She swallowed nervously, shifting uncomfortably. Can I come in? No. My reply came without hesitation, surprising even me. She blinked, clearly taken aback, as if she'd assumed a simple conversation would set things right. She forced a weak smile. Brandon, come on. Just for a minute. I shook my head firmly. There's nothing left to discuss. Her forced smile faded, revealing the cracks beneath. I miss you, she whispered softly. I miss us. There it was, the confession she'd held back, the regret she had buried beneath her pride. Maybe once those words might have meant something to me, but now they rang hollow. I studied her carefully, letting the silence hang thickly between us. She waited expectantly, still hoping I'd relent, hoping to regain control, to matter again. Instead, I simply sighed. "I don't think you miss me," I said calmly. Her eyes widened slightly. "What?" "I think you miss what I gave you, security, stability, the certainty I'd always be here, no matter what you did." Her lips parted, almost arguing, but she knew I was right. She didn't truly miss me. She missed having me around to rely on. She exhaled shakily, eyes pleading. "Can't we at least?" "No," I interrupted firmly, because there was no second chance. No going back. She had broken something beyond repair. Her eyes filled briefly, emotions raw and real. She nodded slowly, stepping back, gripping her purse tightly as if it could somehow anchor her. Then she turned and walked away. This time I didn't watch her leave. I simply closed the door and never looked back.